You feel the rough hemp tighten around your throat as your husband's hand jerks the rope, pulling you forward through the crowd. The morning frost clings to the cobblestones beneath your worn boots, and your breath comes in short, visible bursts that dissolve into the gray Yorkshire air. Around you, faces blur, some curious, some disgusted, others calculating your worth like they would a mare at auction. This is 1832, and you are not livestock. But the law says otherwise. Your husband's voice rises above the murmur of the marketplace. 5 shillings for a woman who can work 16 hours without complaint. Someone laughs. Someone else steps closer to examine your teeth. Before we go any further into this forgotten nightmare, I'd be fascinated to know where in the world you're listening from. It's extraordinary how a story this dark from Victorian England can reach across centuries and continents to wherever you are right now. The practice had a name that sounds almost quaint until you understand what it meant. Wife selling. For over 200 years, across England's market squares and livestock fairs, hundreds of women stood with halters around their necks while their husbands auctioned them to the highest bidder. This wasn't legend or folklore. Court records, newspaper archives, and parish registers document case after case with bureaucratic precision. In Yorkshire alone, 27 documented sales occurred during the Victorian era. The Times, the Morning Chronicle, provincial newspapers, all reported these transactions with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for pig auctions and grain prices. But this wasn't just about men disposing of unwanted wives, though that's the story we've been told. The truth is far stranger, far more desperate, and reveals something profound about what happens when law and justice become irreconcilable enemies. To understand how wife-selling became normalized, you have to understand what marriage meant for a Victorian working-class woman. The moment she spoke her wedding vows, her legal identity vanished. Under the doctrine of coverture, a legal principle that survived into the late 1800s, a married woman ceased to exist as an independent person. Sir William Blackstone, whose legal commentaries shaped British law, stated it plainly in 1753. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. She became what lawyers called femme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath her husband's legal shadow. Everything she owned became his property. Every penny she earned belonged to him. If she inherited money from her parents, he controlled it. If she started a business, he owned it. Even the clothes she wore were legally his possession. If he beat her, the law considered it his right to discipline. If he drank away their food money, she had no recourse. If he brought home venereal disease from brothels, she simply had to endure it. But what happened when a woman couldn't endure it anymore? What happened when her husband's fists left her unable to work, or his drinking meant their children went hungry, or when she fell in love with someone who treated her with kindness instead of contempt? For the wealthy, divorce existed, technically, but it required a private act of Parliament and cost about $1,000, equivalent to roughly $118,000 today. That represented more money than most working-class families would see in 3 lifetimes. Even after 1857, when the Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce slightly more accessible through courts, it still cost around $40, more than a laborer's annual wages. For the poor, there were essentially 4 options: mutual separation that left both parties unable to remarry legally, desertion and hoping not to be tracked down, dying, or selling your wife in the marketplace like a cow. The ritual that emerged was both grotesque and strangely formalized. It typically began with a newspaper advertisement, written in the same language used for livestock sales. Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. She can wash, cook, and milk cows. Sometimes the ads were more direct. John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused. On the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a market square where cattle and sheep were normally sold. The symbolism was deliberate. This was property being transferred, nothing more. The wife wore a halter around her neck, arm, or waist. Sometimes it was rough rope that chafed and burned. Other times it was ribbon, a pathetic attempt at dignity in an inherently degrading ceremony. The husband would call for bids like an auctioneer. What am I offered for this fine woman? 26 years old, can bear children, excellent at needlework, has all her teeth. Men would step forward to examine her. They'd check her hands for calluses that proved she could work. They'd look at her face to judge if she was attractive enough. Sometimes they'd ask her to speak to test her manners. Sometimes they'd pinch her arms to test the firmness of her flesh, as if she were a piece of meat. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. In most cases, the sale was arranged in advance. The buyer was often the woman's lover, and this humiliating public spectacle was actually a form of consensual divorce and remarriage combined into one community-witnessed event. The degradation was real, but it served a purpose. It made the separation publicly legitimate in the eyes of their community, if not in the eyes of the law. Consider the case documented in Brighton in 1826, one of the real incidents that inspired Thomas Hardy's novel The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man led what the newspaper described as a tidy-looking woman to market and sold her for $5 to a sailor. The reporter noted that she seemed nothing loath to go, and that the transaction was conducted with every appearance of good humor. The sailor had likely been courting her for months. All three parties saw the sale as their only way to legally end one relationship and begin another. In Warminster Market in 1830, a wife being sold for 2 shillings and 6pence was so determined the transaction should proceed that when her husband had second thoughts, she slapped him across the face and said, "Let be, you rogue. I will be sold. I want a change." Her voice carries across nearly 200 years, fierce, desperate, seizing what little agency the law allowed. But not every wife sale was a prearranged escape plan between lovers. Some were genuine auctions where women found themselves genuinely being bid upon by strangers, and the terror in those moments must have been overwhelming. In March 1766, a carpenter from Southwark sold his wife at an alehouse in a fit of conjugal indifference. When he sobered up and asked her to return, she refused. He hanged himself. In 1824, in Manchester, a wife was knocked down for 5 shillings, but not liking the purchaser, she was put up again for 3 shillings and a quart of ale. The woman could refuse buyers she found unsuitable. Her consent mattered, at least to the community witnessing the sale. But imagine standing there while strangers bid on you, knowing your future depended on which man was willing to pay the most, hoping desperately that whoever bought you wouldn't be worse than the husband you were escaping. The prices varied wildly and revealed the brutal economics underneath. The highest recorded price was $100 plus $25 for each child, in today's money over $18,000 total. The lowest was a glass of ale. Most sales fell between 2 shillings 6pence and 5 shillings, roughly $20 to $50 in modern currency. But the money wasn't really the point. What mattered was the public nature of the transaction, witnessed by dozens or hundreds of people who could later testify that the woman had been legally transferred. The halter itself held profound symbolic weight. After the sale was complete, it was handed to the new husband as proof the transaction was finished. Sometimes elaborate bills of sale were drawn up using language borrowed from property transfers. I, John Parsons, for and in consideration of the sum of £6 and 6 shillings in hand paid, do sell, assign, and set over unto John Tucker, Ann Parsons, wife of the said John Parsons, with all right, property, claim, services, and demands whatsoever during the term of her natural life. The ceremony often ended with all parties going to the nearest pub for a wedding feast paid for by the new husband. Church bells might even ring. The community treated these occasions as public spectacles. Crowds of hundreds might gather, treating the sale like a combination of theater, court proceeding, and carnival. They weren't just entertainment-seeking voyeurs. though entertainment was certainly part of the appeal. They were witnesses to their community's attempt to solve problems the law couldn't or wouldn't address. They were participating in a form of rough justice, making public what private law kept hidden. Children were sometimes included in the sales, like accessories to the main purchase. In 1865, a woman and her 2 children sold for $100, plus $25 each for the children, a sum representing several years' wages. More often, children were left behind with their fathers. Imagine being 6 years old, watching your mother led away with a rope around her neck by a stranger who just purchased her, not understanding that you might never see her again. The emotional devastation isn't recorded in the historical archives, but it's there, invisible between the lines of newspaper reports written by journalists who cared more about scandal than trauma. The authorities' response was maddeningly inconsistent. Legally, wife selling had no basis in law whatsoever. It was essentially conspiracy to commit adultery followed by bigamy when the new couple married. But many local officials seemed genuinely uncertain about their authority to intervene. In 1819, when a magistrate tried to prevent a sale in Ashbourne, Derby, he was pelted and driven away by an angry crowd. Later, he admitted, "I do not think I have a right to prevent it, because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, of which perhaps it would be dangerous to deprive them." Some poor law commissioners, officials responsible for maintaining the destitute in workhouses, actually forced husbands to sell their wives rather than having the parish support separated families. In 1814, Henry Cook was compelled by Effingham workhouse authorities to sell his wife rather than have the parish maintain her and her child. She was taken to Croydon Market and sold for 1 shilling, with the parish paying for both the journey and a wedding dinner afterward. By the 1840s, the practice began to decline as social attitudes shifted and divorce became marginally more accessible. Newspaper coverage grew more critical, describing sales as disgusting and disgraceful scenes. The rising middle class, increasingly uncomfortable with such public displays of what they saw as working-class barbarism, pushed for prosecutions. Religious reform movements preached against it. Though ironically, in 1889, a member of the Salvation Army sold his wife for 1 shilling in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. Even reformers couldn't entirely escape the practical constraints that made wife selling seem like a reasonable solution. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913. A woman giving evidence in a Leeds police court claimed she had been sold to one of her husband's workmates for £1. By then, the practice was a relic, kept alive more by tradition and desperation than by any belief in its legitimacy. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 had begun to chip away at coverture, allowing wives to keep their earnings and inherit property. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the law began to recognize that women were people rather than property. But for the women who stood in those market squares in the early 19th century, those changes came too late. They lived in a world that offered them no legal identity, no right to their own earnings, no escape from violent or miserable marriages except through the degrading theater of public sale. Some found genuine happiness with their new partners, men who treated them with kindness and respect. Others discovered that changing masters didn't change the fundamental nature of their bondage. All of them paid a price in dignity that no amount of practical benefit could fully compensate. Their stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Wife selling wasn't born from cruelty alone, though cruelty certainly played its part. It emerged from a legal system so rigid and unforgiving that it left desperate people with no other options. These weren't barbaric customs practiced by savages. They were the logical responses of rational people trapped in an irrational system. When the law offers no remedy for an intolerable situation, people create their own remedies, however grotesque. The women who wore halters around their necks and hoped for kinder masters weren't just victims of their husband's cruelty. They were victims of a legal doctrine that declared them invisible, of a society that valued abstract principles over human suffering, of a system that treated marriage as property transfer rather than human partnership. The halters are gone now. The market squares have been converted to shopping districts. The legal doctrine of coverture has been dismantled. But the deeper questions remain, echoing across 2 centuries with uncomfortable persistence. What happens when legal systems fail to provide justice? How do we ensure that progress reaches everyone, not just the privileged few? How do we build societies where nobody has to choose between dignity and survival? The women of Victorian England who stood on auction blocks deserve better than to be remembered simply as victims of historical barbarism. They deserve to be remembered as human beings who faced impossible circumstances with whatever courage they could summon, who seized what little agency the law allowed them, who survived and sometimes even found happiness despite a world designed to crush them. Picture that woman, one last time, standing in the frost-covered market square with rough hemp around her throat. The biting cold nips at her skin, but it pales in comparison to the suffocating weight of her circumstances. She's not merely a historical curiosity or a symbol of past oppression. She embodies the struggles faced by countless women throughout history. She's someone's daughter, someone's mother, and perhaps even someone who loved deeply, hoped fervently, and feared just as intensely as anyone today. In that moment, surrounded by the jeering crowd, she is acutely aware of every scrutinizing gaze. Each face represents a life that is both foreign and familiar, reflecting a society that has reduced her to an object of commerce. The rough hemp digs into her skin, a physical reminder of her captivity, the ultimate representation of her husband's claim over her. This rope, intended to bind her, paradoxically becomes a symbol of her desperation to break free. Her heart races as she contemplates her uncertain future, filled with both hope and dread. When the sale is complete and the halter is finally removed, she walks away into a future she cannot predict, a future that could either lead to salvation or further despair. The crowd disperses, leaving behind only the echoes of their laughter and the remnants of their judgment. She knows that while the transaction may have provided her a semblance of freedom, it also casts her into a new life fraught with unknown challenges. Scattered newspaper reports and faded court records may document her sale, but they cannot capture the essence of her humanity. They cannot tell the story of her resilience, her courage, or the quiet strength that led her to stand there, willing to endure humiliation for a chance at something better. Each step she takes away from that market square is a small act of defiance against a world that has long denied her agency. Her desperation to escape her circumstances is palpable, rooted in the reality of a life where survival often meant navigating a treacherous labyrinth of societal expectations and legal limitations. The haunting memories of her husband's violence and neglect linger like shadows, reminding her of what she has left behind. Yet, within that darkness, a flicker of hope ignites, a belief that perhaps this next chapter could hold more promise than the last. As she disappears into the fog of history, her story serves as a poignant reminder of the struggles faced by women who dared to challenge the status quo. She is not merely a statistic. She represents the countless voices silenced by oppressive systems. The market squares are empty now, yet the questions they raised about human worth, legal justice, and the price of freedom remain as urgent today as they were 200 years ago. In a world that continues to grapple with issues of inequality and injustice, her legacy compels us to confront uncomfortable truths. Are we doing enough to ensure that the rights of individuals are upheld? How do we create a society where no one is forced to choose between dignity and survival? The answers may be complex, but her story echoes forward, challenging us to strive for a world where such choices are no longer necessary. In remembering her, we honor not just her suffering, but her enduring spirit, a testament to the resilience of all who seek justice and freedom.